All right. Pass them to the middle. Pass them up front.
By the end of this, we'll know all these.
So by the end of this, you'll know the answer to all these questions.
Like he's stacking up his post-test. That's what he's doing.
What's it?
He's stacking the post-test. It looks like a rocket.
Exactly. Exactly.
You're right, I changed my mind.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, I promise I do not do that to discourage you, but rather to, I don't know what you know, I don't know what you don't know, so hopefully that will give me a baseline of what to teach to over the next 11 weeks, okay?
You're not going to point us out on Sunday like, Jerry got this many wrong.
No, I would never, ever do that.
The average pretest score was.
Yeah, I wouldn't point you out. I would just put your face and name on the screen.
There's
Yeah.
room for growth.
There's room for growth, which is always a good place to start a class, right? Recognizing that there's room for growth. Okay, so today, let me pass out the outline. Take one, pass it. What's that?
Hand it around.
Yeah, take one, pass it back. Don't pass it out. All right, so we got 11 weeks to talk about the Bible, how to study it, how to observe it, how to apply it, how to actually use it in our lives. So, like I said, these first kind of 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be talking about big picture stuff. So, what is the grand arcing story and narrative of the Bible? And we'll be talking about some of those kind of vocab terms that I was asking about just a minute ago. And then we'll get into more of the actual study, observation, all of that. So we'll be talking about Bible translations and the languages that was written in and some of the history and dates. And I think that's all necessary and useful so that when we actually get into the mud of looking at a single passage or a chapter, that big picture stuff can be floating around our heads as well. Scripture is best interpreted when it can be done in the wider context of the whole thing. Hello, Diane. You made it after all. Welcome. Yes. Everyone will tell you that you came at just the right time. Yeah, we started with a quiz.
You started with the
Well,
quiz.
she
Yeah.
can do it verbally then, don't she?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, come to the front. Do it in front of everyone. All right, so does anybody, and it's okay if the answer is no on this, does anybody remember studying Shakespeare like in high school, middle school, a little bit? How many enjoyed it? One.
I'm a geek, you knew that already.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and the rest, it probably just went over our heads. Shakespeare is best studied like when you actually go to a performance, actually see it. Reading Shakespeare is a pretty tedious thing. But in kind of Shakespearean thought, and this actually predates Shakespeare, it goes back to Greek times, there is the idea of a 5-act play, or a 5-act structure. I'll put this on the screen. There we go. So in a drama of almost any sort, you have 5 acts. Act number 1 would be the prologue. So this is where you're getting introduced to the characters and to the setting. This is like the background information, the stuff that you have to know so that the rest of the story makes sense. Have you ever walked into a movie theater 10 or 15 minutes late and found yourself feeling pretty lost until you can kind of catch up? Or maybe you started like a television series on episode 8 and you missed the first part of the season, so you have to figure out who are these people, what are their motivations, what's their backstory. That's Act 1, prologue. Act 2 is the conflict. Any story worth telling, any story worth reading about or watching or listening to, there's some conflict that kicks things into action. Otherwise, if the story were just, Jack and Jill stayed below the hill, and that's the end of the story. That's all they did. There's not a whole lot of reason to tell that story or read that story. So that's the conflict. They went up the hill. There's rising action in Act 3, so the conflict kicks things into action. Act 3, we see continued drama, continued things going wrong for our characters, going right for the bad guys, maybe a mixture of the two. And then somewhere in Act 3 or Act 4, you have the climax of the story. So whatever the problem is, whatever the bad guy has done, the good guys finally win. They confront the bad guy, and now things can be resolved. Act 4 then is you have falling action, so things are coming back together. All of the conflict, all of the drama is being resolved until you get into Act 5, which is called, fancy French word, the denouement, which is for the story to resolve. And what happens to our heroes at the end of the story? Are they happily ever after, or is there another conflict on the horizon? What is the result of the story that they were just a part of? And most stories follow some version of this. There's basically this and variations on this when you're telling a story. These bottom three words, protasis, epitasis, catastrophe, those are the Greek terms for a Greek 3-act play, but we're paying attention to the 5-act structure up here. Okay? Act 1, prologue. Act 2, conflict. Act 3, rising action. Somewhere in Act 3 or Act 4 is climax, falling action, denouement, or just the resolution of the story.
What are the 2 words under?
This says tone and moral. Yeah. So what's the moral of the story if the story is trying to teach a point? Here's a different way of showing it. Okay, so Act 1, a character and a setting and an inciting incident. Okay, so that would be your Act 2 kind of break right here. So Susie lives in Okoboji, and the floodwaters come and wash her house away. So the character, she's going to have a goal, she's going to have a motivation, and that goal and motivation is recognized by the audience in some way. She lost her home, she needs to do something. So Acts 2 and 3 is going to be all about the struggles. What does she have to do? What does she have to talk to town hall? Does she have to talk to the state? Does she have to get an emergency declared? And there are the conflicts and the problems and the risks and the danger until finally there is the black moment or the crisis or the climax. Is all lost? Susie going to go underwater? Until finally she, meets Kim Reynolds and tells her sob story, and Kim Reynolds says, here's a new house in Okoboji, tax-free. It's a miracle. And then you have Acts 4 and 5 where you have resolution. The house is getting built. You see her, move in. Usually the resolution is a shorter part of the story. And Susie returns home changed. She's learned the moral. She's learned to stand up for herself, confront the powers that be, and now she's a different person on the other side. Okay, that's another way of saying it. Okay, so New Testament scholar N.T. Wright said, let's imagine that Shakespeare left behind a never discovered before play. And the play has all of the marks of a typical Shakespearean play. It's got Act 1 with the background. It's got Act 2 with the conflict and the rising drama. Act 3 with more drama, more conflict. Act 4 with a climax. But Act 5 is missing. What would be the right way to handle that situation? N.T. Wright suggests, give it to a bunch of trained Shakespearean artists. Folks who have studied Shakespeare all their lives, they perform Shakespeare all their lives, they know his tics, they know how he writes, they know how he likes stories to resolve and end and grow, and how characters do their thing. Give it to these actors and have them learn those first 4 acts flat, that they can perform it in their sleep. And then work out Act 5 on your own. So don't write a final ending, because that might do some violence to what Shakespeare intended. Just perform the first 4 acts and then basically improv Act 5. This, he suggests, is what Scripture is. That Scripture is this 5-act drama which we have been given a story, a very large, long, ancient story, but the final chapters are not yet written. And what people's response, Christians, Christ followers' response, is to learn this story so that we can then improv Act 5. When we encounter a book like this, it's easy to go to something like the Ten Commandments, or a list of commandments that Paul might put into his letter, or the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Do this, don't do that, act this way, behave this way. And we can say, I can understand that, I can interpret that. But the majority of Scripture is not a list of commandments. The majority of Scripture is a story. It's narrative. It's so-and-so went here, and then he talked to this person, and then they went over here, and then this bad thing happened, and so then there was this that was a side effect of that, and there was this domino effect, and then these people went over here, and that terrible thing happened. And when you come to a narrative like that, this really big, long narrative that has a songbook in the middle of it, and a different book that's all about like this love story between a man and a woman, and that seems weird. And then you get into the prophets, and they're telling stories about, well, didn't you hear about what Tyre did to Sidon? And then Tyre and Sidon got together, and they took over Israel, and Israel got really upset. How do you interpret, how do you use a story like that to actually do anything with your life? And what N.T. Wright suggests is learn the story, learn those first 4 acts like it's your own story, and then go improv it the rest so the rest of the story makes sense. And we're lucky enough that we do have some hints about how the story ends. We have an idea that in the end, Christ comes back, God wins, that there's this kingdom that's set up, and all, no more suffering and no more tears and no more pain. And so if we know the beginning of the first 4 acts, and we know just a glimpse, a touch of the end of the story, then maybe we could be successful in fulfilling the rest of that 5th act ourselves. How's that sound? Questions, thoughts, comments on that? So, what we're going to be doing this week, next week, is looking at those 5, some people do 6 acts of the story, learning that in big picture, 35,000 foot view, and then that will be the kind of the background information we need to then really get into the mud with the text and start wrestling it down. Okay? Are we good? Oh no, I feel like I've lost you.
So,
Go.
which is the missing? Which are the?
Which one's the missing part?
Yeah. In the Scripture.
Resolution. We see crisis and climax, death of Christ, resurrection of Christ. And then we see the very beginning of the resolution, the book of Acts, what we've been studying at Good News for 2019. And then the church did these things. But Acts is like 10 years long, 15 years long. We see the very end of the story, and then, Revelation 21. And then I look and I beheld the city of Jerusalem. It was 1,800 cubits that way and 1,800 cubits that way, and it comes down to the ground like a giant spaceship. Okay, that's a head scratcher. Thanks, God, for that. What do we do with the end? What do we do with this in-between part? That's the part that is left to us to work out on our own. Yeah. This analogy I like because it helps us make sense of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, which is this big, unwieldy, long thing that it can be really hard, it can be really easy to ignore because so much of it is story, so much of it is narrative that you can't just look at it and say, okay, now, David, some stories are easy. David kills Goliath, little guy beats giant. Okay, I can live that out. But then you get to like the end of Book of Judges, and somebody sends this woman over to the other side of the enemy lines, and the enemy lines chops up this woman into 12 different pieces, and they send her out like, oh, okay, he'll pick me up. What's the application? But if you look at the big wide story, then things begin to make a bit more sense. Okay, let me give you a bit more background, and then we'll get into our acts. Okay. The Bible has 66 books.
I got one right.
You got one. 66 books. There are 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament. There is a period of time in between that lasts 400 years. It's called the intertestamental period. Anybody know that? Yeah. Some might also call it the 400 years of silence. Because it's in here that we have this lack of any sort of biblical literature being written. Next week, we'll talk about the Apocrypha, which are those books that are included in the Catholic Bible, some Anglican Bibles, some of those things. So 66 books, 39 in the Old, 27 in the New. I wish this whiteboard were bigger. The Hebrews or the Jews call the Old Testament the Hebrew Bible. They don't call it the Old Testament. Christians call it the Old Testament. Jews don't. To Jews, it's just the Hebrew Bible. They also call it the Tanakh. You get to clear your throat a little bit when you say that word. Tanakh. And that's an acronym for 3 words. The Torah, also known as the Pentateuch. The Nevi'im, that's a long E sound, Nevi'im, and that's the prophets. And the Ketuvim, and that's the writings. T-N-K, Tanakh. Okay.
And that's what they call the Old Testament.
And this is what the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, those 39 books. Torah or the Pentateuch, which is your first 5 books. The Nevi'im, which are the prophets, which I'll explain that in a moment. And the Ketuvim, which is the writings, and I'll explain that in a moment too. Torah, word that means instruction or the law. And Torah is used a couple different ways in the New Testament. It can mean simply the law, as in you went over the speed limit, you broke the law. It can be used to refer specifically to the Jewish or Hebrew law, so what you'd read in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Or it can refer to the entirety of the Old Testament. Okay, so Paul would say something like, the Apostle Paul would say something, to those under the law, I become like one under the law, is referring to those who live according to the entirety of the Old Testament. Or it can also refer to just the Penta, meaning 5, Tuch, the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. First 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Traditionally, these are assumed to be written by a man named Moses. We'll talk a little bit about authorship in 2 weeks when we talk about how the Bible was put together. But these can also just be called, they have a lot of names. The book or books of Moses. And then you'll hear like someone like Jesus say, "Didn't Moses say?" And then he'll quote something from these first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it could be Genesis, it could be Exodus, it could be Leviticus, it could be any of the 5. Little extra piece of information. When you get to the Gospels, when you get to the first 4 books of the New Testament, you have this group of characters called the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed that all of these were sacred writings, that they were scripture. You have people like the Sadducees, which were a rival group of the Pharisees, and they believed that only the Torah, only the Pentateuch, only the first 5 books were scripture, and that the rest were interesting, but you couldn't base your theology off of.
But the Pharisees thought it was...
The Pharisees thought all of it, all 39 books. Yep, the whole Tanakh. Questions on Torah/Pentateuch? Next, you have the Nevi'im. This is what the Jews or Hebrews would call the prophets. But they use the word in a slightly different way than we use the word prophets, because the prophet starts with Joshua and goes through the books of Kings. So that'd be, well, I shouldn't say it goes through. It includes Joshua, Judges, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, not Ruth. Ruth gets taken somewhere else. Okay. In other words, the history books, Ruth being the exception. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, which in the Hebrew Bible is just 1 book, and Kings, which in the Hebrew Bible is just 1 book. It includes those.
Why do you think one people had it 1 book, another people made it 2 books?
Honestly, it had to do with scroll size.
Really?
Yep. You ran out of room. So the Hebrews notoriously have these massive scrolls. And if you ever go to like a Jewish synagogue and go into their place of worship, they will have these massive, like, almost tomb-like places where they keep the scrolls. And the scrolls are like massive things that they unfurl. And then, so imagine that your reading for the day is Isaiah chapter 65, and there's 66 chapters in Isaiah. When the Christians came along and started making their own copies of Scripture, they were much less wealthy because they were typically persecuted or kicked out of society. And so their availability of big, long scrolls and papyrus was limited, so they started chopping it up into different pieces. So you get 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. True story.
See, you don't need money to do well. You just need God to give you the creativity to do it.
There you go. There you go. So yeah, Nevi'im, prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And then you get to what they call the latter prophets. I'm spelling that wrong. No, not latter prophets. And that's what you would more traditionally think of as the prophets. So that's Isaiah, Jeremiah, not Lamentations, Ezekiel, not Daniel, and then what they call the 12, or what we call the minor prophets. There's another one of your quiz questions. How many minor prophets are there? 12. So you've got your more historical prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and your more what you think of as prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets, to which to this day, despite many thousands of dollars of education, I could not give you the order of. But Amos, Hosea, Joel, Zechariah, Malachi, those. Okay, so that's your Nevi'im.
Which were the two that were not included? Daniel
Not Daniel and not Lamentations.
and not Lamentations.
Yep.
Is Daniel in the 12?
Daniel is in the next category, the Ketuvim, the writings.
Not a prophet.
Not a prophet.
I'll be darned.
Okay? And if you were to buy a Hebrew Bible, which I don't think we have any copies in here, but they would be in this order. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, which I think they would put Malachi at the end. And then you get to the Ketuvim, the writings. And this is basically the Hebrew equivalent of the other category. Okay, so things that fit a variety of different topics and ideas. They're not history, they're not prophetic, they're something else. So you have the 3 poetic books, which they would consider Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, which I know it's kind of weird to put Job under the category of poetry, but if you actually open up to the book of Job and look at the way that the margins are laid out, the way it's lined out, it's put forward as poetry. It is not a prose book. It is a book of poems. And so the back and forth between Job and his interlocutors, his friends, so-called, that argue with him, it's all in metrical form. So Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and then you have what they call the 5. You gotta spell this right. Megalot, which is their word for scrolls. And this is kind of the other category of the other category, the ones that they don't really know what to do with. So you've got Song of Songs, which, if you've not read Song of Songs since you have entered into an adult relationship with another consenting adult, gee whiz, that is a sensual book. You thought it was sensual when you were a teenager reading it. Try it again now. What'd you say?
You mostly giggled and were like, why is this in the Bible?
Yeah, you mostly just giggle, but then you realize how much of it goes over your head. Woo! Boy. So you got that traditionally read on Passover, read or seen as the love story between Yahweh, God, and his people Israel. Ruth, which is again put under the Megalot, the 5 scrolls, typically read over Shavuot, which is the festival that celebrates the giving of the law. Lamentations, a spiritual cousin of Jeremiah, who is said to have written Lamentations, traditionally written over a festival called Tisha B'Av. This festival, you don't hear about it a lot, but it's a Jewish festival, is not even really the right word. It recognizes all the different times that Jerusalem has been destroyed. Kind of a downer, whereas Lamentations is. Ecclesiastes. Jewish festival of Sukkot, when that scroll is typically read. Festival of Booths or Tabernacles. And then finally, Esther, which is read during Purim, which is the celebration of Esther and the bad guy Haman being killed, all that. All right, so you got the poetic books, you've got the 5 megalot, the 5 scrolls, and then finally you get the other category. Daniel, which we'll talk about genre in a couple weeks, but that's the genre of Apocrypha. If you read Daniel, it reads very differently than Isaiah or Jeremiah, kind of a cousin to Ezekiel, but it's really its own category of writing. Ezra, Nehemiah, which is one book in the Hebrew Bible instead of split into 2. And at last, Chronicles. And Chronicles, what we call 2 Chronicles chapter 36, that is the last book and chapter in the Hebrew Bible. So in the Christian Old Testament, it ends with Malachi. In the Hebrew Tanakh, it ends with 2 Chronicles, what they would just call Chronicles. And it ends with the exile and the fall of Jerusalem. And then one last word of hope. Is this King Cyrus? Here's another quiz question for you. King Cyrus makes a decree, and he says, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them." And that's the end of the Hebrew Tanakh. So, destruction of Jerusalem, the decree of Cyrus, and then a giant for the Jews, ... All right. Questions, any blanks you need filled in, anything you need repeated for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim? How you doing, Linda?
So tell me the question, and the answer was King Cyrus. What was the question?
The question was, which Persian king decreed the release of the Jews? And that was King Cyrus. In the last chapter of 2 Chronicles. So Genesis chapters 1 and 2 would be our primary text. But not our only text. We'll talk about a few others as we have time. So Genesis 1 and 2, we have 2 separate accounts of the creation of the world, people, universe, how things came to be. Account number 1 starts, of course, in Genesis 1, chapter 1, and then account number 2 starts at Genesis 2, verse 4. Account number 1 has a certain order for things, and account number 2 has a different order for things. So, let's do day 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning the first day. what do we have in day 1? What does God make? Let there be light. We have light. We also have the act of calling the day light day and the darkness he called night, which is an interesting point in that any religion that Jews would have been neighbors with, or Hebrews would have been neighbors with at this day, would have worshipped the sun, would have worshipped the moon. And God makes light and he makes day, and they are clearly created things that God doesn't even really give a name at this point. They are subservient to his word, his command. Day 2. God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. So we have sky in day 2. Day 3, God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. So he called the dry ground land, and he gathered the water, he called seas, and he saw that it was good. So we have land and sea. Land above, sea below, sky even above that in day 2. God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed according to their kinds. And God saw that was good. It was evening, and it was morning, the 3rd day. So we have land and sea, and on the land we also have vegetation. Also note that the rhythm of this, some would say poem, it's very metrical. And there was evening and there was morning the first day, and there was evening and there was morning the second day, and there was evening and there was morning the 3rd day, and on it goes. In liturgical practice, the day begins at sunset. The Hebrews followed this as well. So
At sunset.
At sunset. So if you are a Sabbath following Jew, Sabbath begins on sunset Friday and goes until sunset Saturday. Okay. And if you are a liturgically minded Episcopalian, Catholic, Benedictine monk, whatever, when you say your prayers when you go to bed, that is the beginning of the day. Because in liturgical tradition, how dare you think that the day begins or the day ends just because you went to bed? God's awake all night. The day keeps going. That's the idea. Okay. Day 4. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them serve as signs. Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on earth. So God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. And he also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. Again, notice, the word sun and moon never shows up. It's just greater and lesser light. So day 1, we have the making of light separated from darkness. Day 4, we have the sun and the moon. So now, what was kind of abstract in day 1 now becomes tangible in day 4. Okay? And stars. Day 5, let the water teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea. We'll talk about the word in a minute. And every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about it, in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, let the birds increase on the earth. And so the sky that was created, and also the sea, which was assumed to be created, it was gathered up in day 3, but separated out in day 2. God fills those up. So sky gets birds, sea gets the fishes, and sea creatures, etc. And then day 6, Let the land produce living creatures. Okay, so the land which had only vegetation before now gets living creatures. According to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, the wild animals, each according to its kind. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, all creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that it may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over all the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Verse 27, so God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. It will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. So God saw all that he had made, and it was not just good, but very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the evening, heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So we have this very symmetrical creation account. Day 1, light. Day 4, sun, stars, moon. Day 2, sky and sea. Day 5, sky and sea are filled. Day 3, land is separated out from the sea. And on day 6, the land is filled. This very orderly account. Now, contrast with a creation myth that was also going around in this time called the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish. Where's my notes? Here is a couple tablets of the Enuma Elish. This was a Babylonian creation myth. Babylon being the group who took the southern kingdom of Judah in exile in the 6th century BC. And this was the predominant myth of the day. So here's the text of Tablet 1. And the heavens above did not exist, and the earth beneath had not become into being. There was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and the demiurge, Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. They had mingled their waters together. That's a sexual euphemism. Before meadowland had coalesced, and reed bed was to be found, but not one of the gods had been formed or had come into being when no destinies had been decreed. The gods were created within them. There was La'amu and La'amu were formed and came into being, and while they grew and increased in stature, all of these different gods were created. They prolonged their days, they multiplied their years, blah, 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 blah. And this goes on for quite some time. So the story goes on that there are basically these wars between the gods, because they are, I don't know, they can't keep it in their pants, and they keep having different god babies, until there is this great kind of WWE-style wrestling match between the two rival god clans, and they start wrestling, and then the sweat from the wrestling and the blood from the wrestling falls onto this little forgotten piece of mud, and out springs humans. To which the gods say, oh no, what have we done? We've accidentally created life. But then one god, I believe Tiamat, has a great idea. What if we take these humans and we enslave them, and we have them build us temples and start sacrificing animals, and then we will never go hungry? That's the Babylonian creation myth. Now contrast that with this, as well as Genesis 2. It's not God's duking it out in the sky and they accidentally spit on the ground and lose some blood, and oops, humans pop out. It's God kneels down and forms and breathes, and man becomes a living soul. There's intention and purpose and relationality. You get further into Genesis 2 and you see Adonai, the Lord, walking in the cool of the garden. He's talking with his creation. He's talking with his humans because he seems to actually like them and wants to spend time with them. Instead of this disorder and this chaos and this pantheon of dozens and dozens of gods, there is one God. One only. There's not a host of gods, but just one who does the creating. There's not a god of the sun and a god of the moon and a god of the stars and a god of the plants and a god of the waters. There is the one God who makes the sun and makes the moon and makes the stars. And in fact, they're so unimportant in the scheme of things that Genesis 1 doesn't even give them a name. So this is what's called a new vocab word, polemical view of Genesis 1 and 2. Anybody know what it means to be polemic? Have you ever told your children, you're being too polemic with me? It means to be argumentative. Okay, a polemic is a...
We'll add it in this week.
Yeah, good. A polemic is a form of argument. And so the argument goes that the writer, the composer, the bringer together of all of these different accounts of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 and etc. are creating a polemic against the overriding myths of the day. You've heard it said, maybe Jesus would put it, you've heard it said that the gods accidentally created you, but they decided to enslave you so that you could feed them in the temples. But I say to you, God created you with intention and purpose and out of relationship and love. You've heard it said that there is a God of the sun who deserves that you sacrifice this, that, and the other thing, maybe even your own blood or your own children's blood to them. But I say to you, it is just the greater light in the sky, and God was the one who created the light in the first place. That's the idea of a polemical view of Genesis 1 and 2. Not because they're just being argumentative for the sake of being argumentative, but they're saying we've got a better gospel. In other words, we've got better news than that. So I bring this up, polemical. You could say that Genesis 1 and 2 just exist in a vacuum. That someone wrote them down this way because it's the way it happened, the end. And what I would say is, I'm not arguing that it's the way it happened or not, but I'm saying someone arranged it and wrote it and structured it and composed it in such a way that a Babylonian or an Assyrian or someone else who would come across this text would be confronted with what's happening. That it was written with confrontation in mind, not just written as bare facts. That's what I'm trying to get across. Does that make sense?
Confrontation to the Babylonian.
Yeah, to the Babylonian. Yeah. And there's, in the past, 120, 150 years since modern archaeological science has happened, we've got dozens of different kind of creation myths unearthed.
Was this written after those?
Good question. Good question. So if you take a traditional view that Moses was the composer of Genesis 1 and 2, Moses was around in 12 to 1300 BC. And even if this wasn't written or put down on tablet yet, it probably still would have been something like the prevailing worldview. So it could still be seen as a response against. How are we doing?
So why would we even have to know about that? This is the first I've even known about that.
The reason I bring it up is that it helps us understand why Genesis 1 is the way it is. It's attempting to answer different questions than maybe the questions that we would naturally bring to it. So a 21st century person is going to come to Genesis 1 with 21st century questions of how were we made, material origins, how many days did it happen, how long were the days, is the earth old, is the earth young? A 10th century BC person is going to come with the question of, come to the text with questions of, what is God like? Are they for us or against us? Do I need to sacrifice my children or not? Are the stars worthy of worship, or is it the Nile, or is it the corn? The questions that they're asking would be different questions. If the author of Genesis 1 and 2 is trying to answer 10th century BC questions, then I need to submit myself to the text and try to get what that author was getting at. If I come to the text with my list of questions that the author has no intention of answering, I'm never going to get the right answer. Does that make sense? That is the work of biblical interpretation. It's not just coming to the text with my questions, but it's also coming to the text trying to figure out what questions is it even trying to answer. Which means that part of my job as a biblical interpreter is how can I best put myself in the mindset of the first people that ever heard this passage. If I grew up all my life hearing the gods are against you, the gods created you by accident, and then I hear this is good news. This is really good news. But I have to put myself in that mindset to really get the full extent of what Genesis 1 and 2 is trying to communicate to me. So that's part of the work of, it's the work of empathy, it's the work of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It just happens that those shoes are 3,000 years old. Good? Let's dig into that even a little bit further. Let's go to some fun passages. Somebody take their Bible, go to the book of Job, chapter 26, verse 12. Somebody else go to the book of Psalms, Psalm 89, verse 9. Okay. Who has Job 26?
I have Job 26. What verse?
I'll tell you in a second. And then somebody else do Isaiah 51. So Job 26, Psalm 89, Isaiah 51.
I've got Isaiah.
Okay. All right, let's do Job 26, 12.
Ready?
Ready.
By his power he churned up the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab. Is that how you say it?
Rahab.
Rahab to pieces.
Good. Okay. By his power he turned up the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab to pieces. Okay. Psalm 89, verses 9 through 12. First part of 12.
You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You have broken Rahab into pieces as one who is slain. You have scattered your enemies with your mighty arm.
Good. Okay. Isaiah 51, 9.
Awake, awake, clothe yourself with strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake in the days gone by, as in generations of old. Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces, who pierced that monster through?
Good. Good. Who the heck is Rahab? Anybody know? Rahab is a sea monster. Creepy whale. It's a good one. It's a good one. Okay, now we can go to these passages and we can ask the question, did Rahab actually exist? Which is the wrong question. Okay, so Rahab is a sea monster used primarily in Egyptian and Phoenician mythology. Okay, Egypt, they're up against the Mediterranean Sea. Phoenicia, they're up against the Mediterranean Sea. Phoenicia is also famous for being their sea traders, and they are the inventors of the alphabet. They needed to create a writing system because they were merchants of the sea. So that's why it's called phonetics, because of the Phoenician Empire. So these two empires, they have this myth about Rahab. Rahab is a sea monster, the monster of chaos. And of course they have a myth about a sea monster named Rahab, because they're the ones who are out on the ocean. Israel has a superstition about the Mediterranean Sea. They are not a seafaring people. They avoid the sea like the plague because they spent about 400 years in Egypt picking up some of these myths about Rahab. So you have writers in the Psalms, in Job, in Isaiah, saying God, Yahweh, the God of the Jews, the God of Israel, is so great that not even Rahab can stand up to him. Is the point that there really is a sea monster named Rahab, or is the point that God is so far high above any other God, any other creature, the monsters of chaos, that not even they can stand up to Adonai, to Yahweh, to God? That is part of the creation story. It's not in Genesis 1 and 2, but it's one of these stories interwoven into Job, Psalms, Isaiah, because it's part of what Israel's worldview. That, okay, God is the God who separates light and darkness. He creates order out of chaos. He separates the sky and the sea. He separates the land and the sea. He moves the sea out of the way that evil, wicked, superstitiously were against its sea, and creates land, and then in order puts things in all of the different places. Also part of our creation myth is the fact that there is a sea monster that we heard about for 400 years in Egypt, and we keep hearing about from our neighbors to the north in Phoenicia, called Rahab. But you know what? We don't care about Rahab because we believe in Yahweh. That's the idea. One more fun one, Psalm 74. Psalm 74. Verses 12 through 17. Anybody can read it aloud.
74.
Yep, 74.
12 through 17.
Yes.
Yet God is my king from of old, who works deeds of deliverance in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength.
See, Genesis 1. Good, keep going.
You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the water.
Yes, keep going.
You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. I feel like I'm supposed to stand up and shout. You broke open springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams.
Yep.
Yours is the day, yours also is the night. You have prepared the light and the sun. You have established all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter.
Perfect, perfect. So again, creation text, a lot in similarity with Genesis 1. You did this to the light and the darkness. You did this to the sea. And you also have, verse 13. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. Great children's book title, right? The Monster in the Waters. That's a creature called Tannin, which Genesis 1 translates as the great creatures of the deep. But basically it's sea monster. And Tannin shows up in a bunch of other creation myths as well. There are the Tannins that pre-existed even the gods, and the gods have to temporarily push them back so that they can create earth. Psalm 74 is, you broke their heads, you cut up Leviathan, you gave it to other creatures as food. It ain't no thing for Yahweh. So,
What is Leviathan, or does it matter?
another sea monster.
Oh,
Yeah.
They were pretty obsessed.
They really, really didn't like the sea. Which, by the way, skipping ahead to the end, Revelation chapter 22. And behold, I see the heavens and the earth, and there was no sea. To anybody who has a lake home or enjoys Florida, you're like, crap, I don't want to go to heaven anymore. No, that's not John's point. John's point, or whoever the author of Revelation is, we'll get to that. The author of Revelation's point is there's no more chaos. There's no more monsters. There's no more source of evil, which is what they saw the sea as. Not, you can't have a lake home in heaven.
so what verses were you referring to with this story right now
Which one? This one?
in Revelation?
That's Revelation 20. It's either 21 or 22.
Okay.
21 verse 1.
Okay.
I got 10 minutes to do 2 more acts. I knew I'd spend a lot of time on Genesis 1. I love it too much. Point being that part of the work of biblical interpretation is you got to know some things about the original readers. Who's Tannin? Who's Leviathan? What's the great sea monster? Why? What do I know about the sea? What do I know about chaos? What do I know about the other gods? Are they afraid of Tannin and Leviathan? Do they defeat them temporarily, permanently? Once I know some of that worldview of a 10th, 9th, 8th century BCE person or a 1st century person for the New Testament, then these texts begin to come alive in a way they don't before. Now all of a sudden you start noticing Rahab show up in the Psalms, and you're like, who the heck is Rahab? Oh, right, it's another sign that God is preeminent and sovereign over creation. How are we doing? Thoughts, questions, comments, pushback?
I have nightmares about sea creatures.
You're welcome. I have a whole list of theological themes here that we could talk about. We see the inherent goodness of creation. What's the refrain? And God said that it was good. 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 It was very good. We see God's relationship with creation. It's one of intimacy and closeness, interaction, particularly when you get into Genesis 2. God's in the garden. You see the equality of humanity. So God makes people in his image. Imago Dei is the Latin term. To be made in the image of something. This was a common practice by Sumerian kings. So Sumer, just to the east of Israel, modern day Iraq, Iran. If you were a Sumerian king or lord, you would go and conquer a village or a city, and you would place a big statue of yourself in that city called a imago, or an icon. Then you could go back home and receive the tribute or the taxes from that village that you had conquered. And they would be reminded that day in and day out, when they went into the city square and saw your image, your icon, that who was in charge? It wasn't them, it was you sitting back on your fat throne. God says, I'm going to create people, and I'm going to create them in my image, and then I'm going to give them rule or dominion or stewardship over the earth. And so Imago Dei has to do with he takes this idea of what the other kings were doing, the other lords from other nations, and says, yeah, that kinda, but let me make it true of all people. That my ruling, my stewardship, my kingdom, I am giving to my creation in human beings. And that is meant to be our job. Let me give you 3 more terms. Again, this is all Genesis 1. Imago Dei, we are made in the image of God. Now we're pulling theology out of Genesis 1. Missio Dei, we are given the mission of God. Coram Dei. And we do all of this in the presence of God. Made in the image, given his mission, and we do this in his presence. God doesn't then leave. That's the God of deism, the God that sets the clock, winds it, backs away, lets all things just happen according to chance or a mechanical view of the universe. No, God stays involved, and yet he gives us his image and his mission. He grants us permission. He says, go, rule, be stewards, be fruitful, multiply. But Act 2.
This may be just trite and stupid.
Yeah.
But it just really bugs me. So we're talking about Rahab, and every time Rahab comes up, it's a sea monster or something bad. But then there's Rahab.
There's Rahab in the book of Judges.
Okay.
Yep.
Totally different.
Different lady.
Okay. I just,
Yeah.
you said something about, and every place else in the Bible something, and I thought, wait a minute, you mean she's a reference?
There are 3 Rahabs in the Old Testament. There's the Rahab of the book of Judges, who helps Israel in the conquering of Jericho. There's Rahab the sea monster. And then related to Rahab the sea monster, Egypt is also sometimes called Rahab, just as a nation.
Really?
Yep. The fall, your primary text, I would say, is Genesis chapters 3 through 11. I would argue that what the author of Genesis is trying to communicate isn't just a single moment of the fall, though obviously what happens in Genesis 3 is a big deal. Eve, with Adam standing right next to Eve, partake of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. They eat it, and they discover what death is, and it's not what they thought. They discover what it is to know good and evil, and it's not the promise that they thought it was going to be. But then the fall keeps happening. So then you get to Genesis 4, and you have the relational troubles between Cain and Abel, which ends up in murder. And then you get to Genesis 6, and you have some sort of weird relationship happening between maybe celestial creatures or some sort of holy people and not holy people, which then ends up with the flood and the uncreation, chaos being unleashed back onto the earth. So God pushed the waters, got rid of Rahab, and yet because of the evilness of humanity, chaos comes rushing in again. And then you have the introduction of covenant, but then the covenant is immediately broken by Noah and his sons. And then you get to Genesis chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel. And here you see humanity basically attempting to usurp God himself by building themselves a big old tower in the middle of the plain of Shinar. God says, no, you don't. And thus you have the spreading of humanity across the planet. So I'd say Act 2 is, this is your inciting incident. This is Lake Okoboji Susie having her home destroyed by the flood. And what is she going to do about it? This is Genesis 3 through 11. Theological themes, you've got the introduction to death, the brokenness of 4 fundamental relationships. Go away. 4 fundamental relationships. To God, to people, to creation, and to self. All broken. God no longer walks in the cool of the garden. We start killing each other. The ground starts working against us for our harm instead of bearing fruit. And now we have a false view of ourselves where instead of being properly viewed as the image of God, we now want to try to usurp God and get in his place. Just like there are other creation stories, like the Enuma Elish, there are other flood stories. In most ancient cultures, there is some version of a flood story, most famous of which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, about this ancient figure who tries to defeat death and tries to make a bargain with the gods, and meanwhile the whole earth is flooded and he loses all of his family and friends. There are also flood stories in Native American cultures, European cultures, and this makes sense for a couple of reasons. One, there really either was a historical flood, or two. Every culture depends on water to grow food, and if your entire culture depends on the dependability of a river or a shore, so you can grow, whatever it is you're growing, and then a flood happens, you're probably going to write a story about it because your culture was decimated in some way or another. So then Genesis chapter 12 comes along, Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8 with the Noah and the flood. And again, it's a polemical trying to tell something true about God's story. God is not the God who abandons creation, but rather rescues creation. God is not the God who just lets the chaos reign again, but actually is trying to redeem some good part of it. Yeah. With that, it is 8 o'clock, and we will do the rest of the story next week. I have one assignment. This comes from a book. I have an article for you to read. It comes from a book called The Drama of Scripture, which goes into much greater detail about each of these acts. And this is just basically an overview of kind of what we talked about tonight and the idea between that 5 or 6 act story and how we are meant to be the finishers of it. So take a chunk, read it. One for everybody. Yeah.
She just put here for everybody.
And we will continue next week.